Welcome to this presentation on the hypothetical use of role-playing games for the treatment of a traumatic brain injury client. Presented by W.A. Hawks Robinson and his RPG research project at www.rpgresearch.com. Originally presented at Eastern Washington University for the class Recreation Therapy for People with Disabilities, March 11, 2013. Revised for Internet release August 28, 2013. Thank you for viewing this video. I am an undergraduate at Eastern Washington University working on interdisciplinary degrees in recreation therapy, music, and research psychology, as well as separate personal projects completely separate from the university. Over the years, I have worked with a number of people that have experienced various kinds of traumatic brain injury, or TBI. Also, though not technically TBI, my mother experienced a neurological cardiovascular event that caused oxygen to stop flowing to her brain for 12 to 14 minutes back in 2007, and she underwent very similar experience to many traumatic brain injury patients, as well as the recovery process. Thankfully, she was one of those 1 in 100,000 chances and is mostly recovered, though there are some significant life-altering changes she has yet had to adapt to. Though in this presentation I focus mostly on a recovery stage 1 out of 4 stages that the therapeutic recreation therapist would work with when working with this hypothetical client, I will briefly mention the other stages towards the end just to show the variety of possibilities using therapeutic role-playing games as the recreational intervention for clients at different stages of recovery. A reminder, of course, this is completely hypothetical. I'm not aware of anyone as of yet actually attempting to implement this. So besides the motivation during the quarter that I took the related class, you can see this also has a personal experiential reason. In 1990, I worked as a certified nursing assistant and LPN in training at Doxy Hatch Long-Term Medical Center in Salt Lake City, Utah, where they had several patients in comas, some with severe paralysis and others with various serious impairments. Also around that time, I was working at Hillcrest Care Center in Sandy, Utah as a habilitation therapist, where I worked with various levels of special needs, mostly helping them prepare for the morning before they went off to recreation therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, and other programs. And some of those patients there had been fully functional prior to experiencing traumatic brain injuries from skiing and similar injuries causing permanent impairments. Then in August 22, 2007, my mother had an incident that caused brain damage due to lack of oxygen for 12 to 14 minutes, and I was closely involved during her initial recovery process. They said it was a 1 in 1,000 chance that she would live, and then another 1 in 1,000 chance that she would have any cognitive functioning or awareness at all. Thankfully, she beat the odds and is doing very well a number of years later, though there are some significantly notable life changes. In this hypothetical scenario, the chosen recreational therapy activity for the client to achieve maximal benefit toward recovery involves 4 forms of role-playing game approaches as the client progresses through 4 stages of the recovery process. During stage 1 of recovery, we will use variants of the Choose Your Own Adventure, or CYOA, approach. During stage 2, we'll look at using computer-based role-playing games, both offline and online options. During the stage 3 recovery, tabletop role-playing games will be introduced to allow more personal interaction as capabilities increase. And finally, during the stage 4 recovery, live-action role-playing will be used as an adjunct or alternative to physical therapy and other possibilities. As the client gradually improves functionality, the client can hopefully progressively take on greater challenges toward increasing self-sufficiency capabilities. in activities that the client will enjoy participating in. This hypothetical client was involved in an accident and received multiple injuries to various parts of the brain and body. We will focus on the traumatic brain injury aspects in this scenario. Traumatic brain injury, TBI, in this case includes diffuse injury and some localized concussive and piercing injuries to specific parts of the brain. The client's initial functional level, when the recreation therapist is introduced to the case, is just emerging out from an induced coma with minimal interactive capacity. The client's stamina is currently limited to durations around 15 to 30 minutes at most, between extended hours of rest. The client is rated at Ranchos Los Amigos cognitive levels 2 and 3, able to open eyes in response to stimuli such as a spoken request or physical touch. The client can only initially communicate through slight squeezes of the right hand, answering simple yes and no questions. Due to swelling from a concussive injury at the occipital lobe, the client currently has complete visual impairment, though the prognosis is hopeful that this may be temporary. The client does not appear to have any hearing impairment and appears to understand speech and, initially, simple directives. The client is daily showing improving signs of comprehending increasingly complex directives, but does show indications of memory impairment both from past long-term memory and the ability to incorporate new short-term memories into long-term memory, though the prognosis also is hopeful that this is temporary. The client also shows indications of periodic disorientation and/or frustration, and is clearly in significant pain, requiring very short therapeutic periods and significant pain medication. Though the client can comprehend and respond to simple yes-no questions via hand squeeze and/or eye blink, complex interaction is limited. Despite this severely limited level of functioning, the client can actually begin, potentially, to participate in a therapeutic recreation activity using the modification of tabletop role-playing games through the binary interactive use of the classic choose-your-own-adventure simplified form of role-playing game. After consultation with the family and caretakers, it is determined that prior to injury, one of the client's favorite activities included various forms of role-playing games. The client mostly preferred tabletop, but had dabbled with both computer-based and live-action forms. As the client slowly regains various levels of functioning, modified versions of role-playing games will be presented in which the client may participate. This is presented in the hopes that it will accelerate and encourage neuroplasticity and recovery of the brain and body as quickly as possible. As per Porter 2010, quote, modalities chosen reflect the client's interest to maximize attention, motivation, and willingness to participate in the task. Quote, activities that engage the client in watching, listening, and other purposeful sensing, Porter 261, and conditions due to brain impairment, e.g. stroke, brain injury, focus on the use of graduated fine hand activities and repetition to develop neural connections to promote fine hand use or neuroplasticity. Porter, page 293. The recreation therapist will ask the client, would you like to play a simple version of a role-playing game? Squeeze or blink once for yes, 2 for no. The client indicates yes. Here's a quick example of a choose-your-own-adventure modification of role-playing gaming that the client could actually engage in for brief periods each day through the guidance of the recreation therapist. This intervention addresses many areas, but some key codes addressed include D115 for listening, D163 for thinking, D310 communication with receiving spoken messages, D1750 solving simple problems, D177 making decisions, and D9200 play. This adventure is set in Chicago during the Roaring Twenties. It is a mystery-style adventure. Of course, any genre or setting would work. You will have 3 characters you can choose from. I will first list the 3 options, then I will ask you which one you prefer as I go through the list a second time. You will then indicate yes when I mention the character you want. And the following examples in quotes will be directed as though speaking directly to the client, expecting an answer. This adventure is set in Chicago during the Roaring Twenties. It is a mystery-style adventure. Of course, any genre or setting will work. You will have 3 characters you can choose from. I will first list the 3 options, then I will ask you which one you prefer as I go through the list a second time. You will then indicate yes when I mention the character you want. You may choose to play 1, a police detective, 2, a private eye, or 3, an investigative reporter. The recreation therapist states, would you like me to repeat that list again, yes or no? And have you decided which option to pick from those 3 choices? When the client indicates yes to being ready to choose, the recreation therapy states, I will now repeat those 3 choices. Squeeze once for yes when you hear the option you want. The client in this case chose private eye. The recreation therapist then asks, you've chosen private eye, is that correct? The client confirms with a single squeeze or blink. The recreation therapist continues to read from the adventure book. The story unfolds as follows. An old man has come to your office. His house has been robbed of a family heirloom they have had for generations. The police have no leads, but he says everyone knows that you, as the ace private detective that you are, can use alternate channels to find things the police can't or won't. The recreation therapist then continues to tell the story to the client, periodically presenting binary-only questions in the choose-your-own-adventure style. Initially, these sessions would likely only last about 10 to 15 minutes, but they could be slowly increased in duration as the client improves in stamina. And as overall functioning improves, the client may begin to be able to handle multiple choice questions rather than just Boolean options. The sessions can steadily increase in complexity and duration, adapted to the client's changing capabilities. So some of the benefits from this very simplified form of role-playing game would be basic cognition, social interaction from the verbal dialogue, simple to moderate problem solving, speech comprehension, should encourage brain plasticity, as all of these steps should, and then of course I mentioned the relevant codes earlier. Now at stage 2 of the recovery process, the client has regained full visual function, though has not regained most speech and is only able to answer with simple monosyllabic words, and still has extremely labile facial expressions and behavior. The client has significant aphasia and is continuing treatment with a speech therapist, though the long-term prognosis is uncertain but hopeful. The client only has a limited motor function of the right arm, hand, and fingers with full sensory response. The client is able to move the head slightly left and right or up and down, and stamina now is about 30 minutes. Though the client's cognitive functioning is now higher, the client's ability to actually communicate is still severely limited. Based on current functioning, it's recommended to have the client try using a mouse or a Wii-mote to participate in an offline computer-based RPG that is turn-based rather than real-time. What that does is the game will wait for the client to take however long they need to take to make a decision and action before moving on to the next step and the next step, as opposed to a real-time game where the action happens regardless of, without waiting for you. So the client is able to move and click both buttons on a mouse, can see the computer screen clearly, and has enough cognitive functioning to interact in the game at a much higher level than previously. So in addition to addressing some of the previous codes in intervention number 1, intervention number 2 also addresses D1751, solving moderately complex problems, D440, general fine hand use, and D4401, grasping development. Some of the activities from intervention number 1 should still be continued, especially for the socialization benefits. Of course, the client may need constant supervision and assistance from the recreation therapist. But as the continuing recovery proceeds, there may be less and less dependence on the recreation therapist for the client to engage in the activity. Some of the benefits of this computer-based role-playing game approach: gross movement of the arm and hand, a little bit of movement and exercise, building up the functioning there. Fine movement of clicking the fingers. Of course, the general cognitive problem solving and the previously mentioned relevant codes. Now at stage 3, intervention number 3 option, the client's impairment is around T1 to T4 and should hopefully still be temporary and continue to progress. Clients regained use of the entire upper body, can engage in light speech using very simple sentences, but still has some aphasia, cannot move legs, and has unpredictable control of bowels and bladder. The client's stamina has increased to about an hour for recreational activity capacity before needing rest. The client affect is no longer labile, and so now that the client has further improved, still has some moderate speech and cognitive impairments, and the client's bored with the speech therapy drills and still needs to keep challenging him or herself to continue the brain's recovery and rerouting of neural pathways, especially for the receiving and speech centers. So now at this point, the client hopefully can participate in the classic tabletop role-playing game, and with fairly minimal modification, though patience may be required. The client can use a wheelchair. Some assistance may be necessary from other participants to be patient during the game, and assist is needed when the client has trouble communicating correct word or intention verbally. The client at this point should be able to fully manipulate, read, and calculate simple dice rolls and simpler character variable calculations, though may have some trouble with verbally expressing some of the results. In addition to some of the previous codes in the earlier interventions, this form of role-playing game could potentially address some of the codes at the much more advanced levels and some additional codes such as D172 calculating, D1751 complex problem solving, D350X, that whole series, for conversations, starting, sustaining, and ending conversations with a single person and a group of people, D440X, even finer hand use, writing with the pencil, for example, D4401, grasping and moving dice and miniatures, miniatures and such being optional, D4403, releasing refinement, being able to grasp and then release in a controlled manner, and D9205, socializing. This is a big one, especially with tabletop role-playing gaming, which is a cooperative rather than competitive activity. So the client can comprehend letters, rulebooks, dialogue, and mildly complex scenario puzzles, and really should only need minor modifications in the game and the other participants. The tabletop interaction with other players and the game master will probably need to operate at a slower pace than, quote, normal, but the client will be able to participate in this activity fairly normally. He can handle and write with paper and pencil, engage in the adventure dialogue between the game master and the others, and will increasingly be able to work on comprehension and communicating desired player character actions and action resolution. And these get to be more complex levels of thought as the game progresses, if desired. The client can understand the rules discussion and the enforcement, though occasional repetition or clarification may be necessary. As mentioned previously, tabletop role-playing game is an extremely social activity. And so this really can help with the recovery process in the social interaction of an activity together with the other players and the game master. Now, the game master may be the recreation therapist, or the recreation therapist may just be on hand to help guide and the other participants, or at least the client. The client can have increasingly complex dialogue with the other players and game master for both in-game and out-of-game discussions, and the client should be able to engage in cooperative play as the key to tabletop role-playing gaming in the shared narrative, and with increasingly complex problem solving through group interaction. Of course, all of this is talking about neuroplasticity and trying to maximize that in a mode that is the most engaging and useful for the client. So some likely benefits expected from participation in tabletop role-playing games would include writing and reading comprehension, social skills, cooperative play, joint and individual complex problem solving, speech, listening and comprehension, math, and many, many others. Finally, at stage 4, using the final variant of intervention number 4, the client has been recovering and prognosis likely permanent for most of the effects, although there'll still be some gradual improvement. They won't be as dramatic as earlier. It's an L3 injury. The client regained some ability to walk with assistance of support products, braces and crutches, and speech is mostly recovered, though still occasional aphasia, especially when tired. The client has improved from much of the past amnesia, but still shows some continued loss of some past memories. Client no longer shows impairment for retaining new memories, and the client's now able to control bodily functions without assistance from other people. So to address the issues with walking, balance, and coordination, the client could elect, to continue this whole theme of role-playing gaming, to begin participating besides in the Choose Your Own Adventure and the computer-based and computer-based online and the tabletop. There's also the option of live-action role-playing, both while in a wheelchair and with braces and crutches and other options. Though the client does have some signs of spastic movement, the prognosis is positive if client continues to engage in regular physical activities, though averse to regular workout regimens or physical therapy. So hopefully using the live action role play to make it more engaging and would continue to address it by participating. The client is willing to do LARP for the physical regimen and initially participates in a controlled clinical setting with other LARPers. Over time, may be able to participate in LARP activities outside of the clinical setting. This particular intervention addresses all of the earlier codes, or most of them, plus adds a larger physical aspect, some new codes such as the D41XX, various changing and maintaining of basic body positions, stand up, sitting down, etc. The D430X, moving and handling of many different objects, and D465, moving around using equipment such as wheelchairs, walker, crutches, etc. Here you see a couple of versions of someone's idea of steampunking out their wheelchair in some really creative ways. And these are people who, in the live action role-playing world, they use sort of 1800s technology to try to do modern things. It's increasingly popular in recent decades. So, through the use of role-playing games, modified to fit the client's diverse needs, the client was able to receive a broad range of benefits from a favored recreational activity that provided improvements to cognition, speech, social interaction, mathematics and general problem solving, fine motor skills, gross motor skills and balance, as well as many other potential benefits. Of course, all of this is completely hypothetical at this point, but hopefully at some point professionals will be able to implement some of these, for example, Choose Your Own Adventure, and see if the benefits that are expected are realized. I hope you enjoyed this, and I look forward to your feedback and commentary, and I'll gladly make any changes, amendments, and corrections based on that feedback. Remember, www.rpgresearch.com.